So we've already seen the digestive functions of the pancreas. It secretes enzymes and digestive juices into the small intestine. This is the exocrine function of the pancreas, because the term exocrine implies that the substance that the gland is producing is being secreted into a cavity. There are specific cells within the pancreas that are called acinar cells that fulfill this function of producing and secreting digestive enzymes. However, the pancreas also has other cells within it that function in an endocrine capacity. Those cells will produce two important hormones which function to regulate blood glucose. The pancreas functions as a digestive gland because it creates an alkaline fluid, along with several enzymes like trypsin, which functions to digest proteins, and pancreatic amylase, which digests starches into monosaccharides. The pancreatic juice and the enzymes are secreted into the duodenum of the small intestine. But it also contains many capillary beds within it that the endocrine cells will secrete their hormones into. Nested between the acinar cells that produce the enzymes and digestive fluids are small clusters of endocrine cells. These clusters are called pancreatic islets, also called the islets of Langerhans. The major hormone-producing cells that the islets contain are called the alpha cells and the beta cells. The alpha cells produce a hormone called glucagon, while the beta cells produce a hormone called insulin. So glucagon is the hormone that is produced and secreted by the alpha cells, and it's a hormone that functions to increase blood glucose when blood glucose is low. The primary target of glucagon is the liver, and it stimulates the liver to break down stored glycogen, as well as promoting gluconeogenesis within the liver. So as blood glucose falls, the pancreas will be stimulated to secrete glucagon. Glucagon will then target and stimulate the liver to break down glycogen into glucose and then release that glucose into the bloodstream. Glucagon also promotes gluconeogenesis, in which the liver will use fatty acids as well as amino acids in order to create glucose and then also release that glucose into the bloodstream. All of these cause the blood glucose to rise up to the typical 90 milligrams or so per 100 milliliters of blood. The beta cells of the pancreas produce and secrete the hormone called insulin. This hormone functions to decrease blood glucose when blood glucose is elevated, such as after a meal. Insulin targets most body cells, and insulin is necessary to help the cells of the body transport glucose from the blood and across their plasma membrane. The hormone also targets the liver, which will help with the conversion of glucose into glycogen. Insulin also acts as a growth regulator because it promotes protein synthesis as well as adipose tissue synthesis. When blood glucose levels rise, the beta cells of the pancreas are stimulated to secrete insulin. Insulin, as mentioned previously, will target most body cells and is a necessary component to help those cells absorb glucose from the blood and transport it across their plasma membrane. So without insulin, the body's cells have a very difficult time transporting the glucose across the membrane and into the cell. In the liver, the hormone will stimulate the conversion of glucose to glycogen, and it's also going to stimulate the adipose tissue to uptake glucose and use it to make fats. So all of these effects will cause blood glucose to fall back down to their typical range of about 90 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood. Diabetes mellitus is a condition in which the blood glucose remains elevated, creating a high urine output, as well as a host of other serious issues. It has two main causes. Diabetes mellitus type 1 is caused by an autoimmune disease that destroys the beta cells of the pancreas. So those are the insulin-producing cells of the pancreas. Diabetes mellitus type 2 is a condition in which the pancreas does secrete sufficient insulin, however the body is resistant to the effects of that insulin. We see that type 2 diabetes is the most common, representing about 95% of diabetes mellitus cases. In both conditions, however, blood glucose will remain elevated because the glucose has trouble getting into the cells where it can be used. Type 1 diabetes mellitus can be treated with regular insulin injections or insulin pumps. Type 2 diabetes mellitus can typically be treated with diet and exercise changes, which makes the body less resistant to the effects of insulin, and it also works to keep blood glucose more consistent as a result. With both types of diabetes mellitus, high urine output occurs because of the high glucose concentrations in the filtrate. These concentrations will draw water out of the tissues and into the filtrate. Because a high volume of water is lost in the urine, this creates a persistent thirst, which will help to replace the water lost through the urine, assuming that that person is consuming enough water regularly. Hunger is also persistent because the body is unable to use the glucose that's in the bloodstream, so even well-fed individuals are still hungry. I've often heard diabetes mellitus referred to as starving in the land of plenty. Since glucose cannot be used as fuel, this then forces the body to use other sources to make energy, such as lipids and proteins. When lipids are used as fuel, they create a byproduct known as ketone bodies, which ketone bodies include substances like acetone. This causes the pH of the blood to become more acidic, that is, it causes the pH of the blood to drop. This results in a condition called diabetic ketoacidosis, or DKA. Persistent elevation of blood glucose causes other issues as well. It severely damages blood vessels, particularly small capillaries, that can lead to infection or even tissue necrosis or death. If the blood vessels are located within the kidney, then this affects the kidney's ability to produce filtrate and cleanse the blood. So eventually enough damage to the small blood vessels in the kidney will lead to kidney failure, and the patient would require dialysis. The tissue death, particularly in the tissues of the lower limbs, may be severe enough to require amputation. Damage to the small blood vessels in the retina of the eye will slowly kill the retina, causing partial or total blindness, a condition that's called diabetic retinopathy. The tissue damage could also include damage to the nerves that would cause a loss of sensation called neuropathy. Too much insulin, on the other hand, can also be problematic. Hypersecretion of insulin promotes too much blood glucose uptake, causing hypoglycemia, which is a very rapid drop in blood glucose. This leads to tremors, weakness, disorientation, as well as unconsciousness, because the nervous system functions very poorly when blood glucose gets very low. Hypoglycemia usually results when a patient with diabetes mellitus administers too much insulin and can easily be treated by consuming sugars.